Yeah, that's some good stuff. Greetings, Shadow Chasers and Dust Makers. I am the Jordan Scholar, and with me, as always, is my faithful Snow Leopard Demon, Anthora. Anthora, would you care to say anything to the class now that we got some people here? No, maybe I'm sorry, she's a little shy, not like in a scary golden monkey sort of way, but nonetheless. As I was saying, I am the Jordan Scholar, and welcome to my Jordan College, where we're going to be studying everything related to Philip Pullman, his dark materials, and of course, the Book of Dust. And there is a white elephant demon, I guess you could say, in the room that we'll just get out of the way ahead of time. If I'm going to really pull this off, shouldn't I have like a cool British accent or something? Well, alas, I don't. So we're just going to have to like power on through with what we're doing right now. But, I mean, I do have a Jordan College alumni t-shirt, so just to prove that, I am really putting in an effort here, guys. I'm just saying. So yeah, I have been wanting to do a YouTube channel like this for a while. I have done a kind of Pullmanverse related blog that a few of you may have read, but YouTube is really where it's at. I had a couple things holding me up though. One, I had to figure out how to get my Mac projecting lantern here working, because iMovie, yeah, between you and me and Anthora, iMovie just is weird sometimes. And two, I also had an idea years ago for a scholarly book on his dark materials. I had written something like that before on something else. And I had always planned on kind of launching that first. However, if I'm entirely honest, it's been slow going. It's been a crazy couple of years. Sorry, Anthora. It's been a crazy couple of years. And yeah, I've managed to do about 55 double-space type pages, including a pretty formidable preface and introduction, but that's about as far as I've gotten. I've only gotten a few chapters in. So, in the interest of just kind of speeding things along, I thought about just reading the first chapter and putting it up on YouTube and just kind of seeing what you guys think. As far as the actual writing process, I've been doing this kind of writing for a while. I mean, I was an English major at my own Jordan College. But yeah, I was just doing stuff that I've rarely done. I would just rewrite stuff, chapters over and over again. I would like rearrange paragraphs, and everything came out like really well. It just took a lot of time. And plus I'm having to go back and learn how to do like the bibliographies again, chapter notes, works cited page, and basically, yeah, and just learn how to cite like YouTube videos, for instance, like this. And online articles and all that sort of thing, which was not really in vogue back in my day. Yeah, God, I sound really old when I say that. And also, I know at the end of all this, what's awaiting me is a book index. And yeah, I mean, if you've never done a book index before, then that's a pretty solid lifestyle choice. So kudos to you. So yeah, I guess the book is just gonna kind of be my dissertation here at our Jordan College. And it's titled His Dark Materials, or rather the world that his dark materials built, and it's subtitled Exploring the Poetry and Philosophy of the Philip Pullman Trilogy, because you gotta have a good subtitle. Not to mention poetry is gonna, we all know how much poetry means to Philip Pullman, going all the way back to Enid Jones's class when he was first reading Paradise Lost aloud, to right now he's still the current president of the William Blake Society in London, so it all kind of ties together. Not to mention, and this is perhaps not, other people have treaded around this kind of thinking before, and it's maybe not the most profound insight, but it occurred to me at some point that the Golden Compass, aka Northern Lights, is actually about, among other things, a young girl learning to read, and specifically learning to read in a very subtle, nuanced, symbolic, and dare I say it, poetic sort of way. And basically I'm going to be splitting the book into like 3 parts, assuming I ever get it done. And basically the first chapter of each part is going to be about one particular artifact or instrument, normally of a titular nature, like the amber spyglass or the subtle knife. And of course, my part on the Northern Lights is going to feature the alethiometer. So that's basically what the chapter that I'm going to be reading you guys aloud in a second is going to be about. It's going to be about the alethiometer, and it's going to be about reading. And yes, I mean, Anthor's given me some grief about this. I mean, I know this is the first day of class, and this is going to be a pretty big thing. I promise most of my videos, if I continue to make videos like this, are not going to be this long. But I am giving you guys, like, an entire chapter of my book. So I hope you enjoy. I hope everybody makes it through. I hope nobody, like, falls asleep. But nonetheless, I mean, this is the time you can toast the tokai, you can break out the smoke leaf. And you can rest easy knowing that we're all protected under scholastic sanctuary. So thank you guys and enjoy, and I'll see you on the flip side. While Northern Lights has countless memorable passages, crafted in beautiful lyrical prose, one of the most striking is when Lyra Belacqua finally arrives in the north. On a mission to rescue children who have mysteriously gone missing, she is taken up with a group of water-faring Egyptians. From the deck of a large ship, the little girl gazes up into the heavens one dusky twilight and nearly falls into the sky. As if masterfully painted on the canvas of night itself, the aurora borealis is flickering and shimmering above, the titular northern lights seemingly a living and breathing thing. The longer Lyra stares up into them, the more enraptured she becomes by their majestic symphony of light and color. Finally, she cannot help but wonder if the same ineffable power which animates the aurora also inspires her own recently acquired alethiometer. When the author of this scene once outlined how best to live a life, he framed them as a series of, quote, as-if propositions. Pullman meant that even if all his propositions might not constitute a provable, definitive statement on reality, they nonetheless served as a very reasonable way to poetically and psychologically ground oneself in existence. The particular proposal that comes to my mind when reading the passage above is the one regarding how we should live, quote, as if the universe were listening to us and responding, end quote. Unsurprisingly, romantic thought may have inspired this, as one only has to read Percy Shelley's famous ode, where he calls on the west wind to, quote, drive my dead thoughts over the universe, like withered leaves to quicken a new birth, end quote. To soundly evoke a universe that somehow listens to us and creatively responds. Pullman's marvelously inventive alethiometer is clearly a powerful metaphor for this same philosophy. In my preface, the importance of and need for some kind of ongoing dialogue or interaction between human beings as individuals and the cosmos as a whole was directly addressed. Lyra's philosophical speculation regarding the aurora comes when its transcendent beauty lulls her mind to that special state of relaxed awareness, similar to what is required for reading the alethiometer. Her intuitive sense that what sets the northern lights aglow may very well be that which enlivens the needles of her device is a significant poetic insight, somewhat analogous to Walt Whitman's line proclaiming, quote, a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars, end quote. Channeled through the medium of the alethiometer, our young heroine is brought into immediate participation with realities infinitely larger than herself, yet simultaneously deeply embedded within her. A proverbial leaf of grass forged in stardust. Quote, we've really forgotten that meaning is something that arises out of interaction, Iain McGilchrist recently observed during an interview. A writer, lecturer, and psychiatrist, McGilchrist first came to my attention when he was referenced by Pullman in an article he wrote about William Blake. Both men have given powerful addresses to the Blake Society, and both have an abiding love for romantic poetry. In Chapter 8, more emphasis will be placed on McGilchrist's startlingly original work concerning the brain hemispheres, specifically how it relates to the human-demon relationship in his Dark Materials. For now, though, McGilchrist importantly elaborated on his ideas regarding an interactive universe in another interview, a universe in which human beings do not exist independently from reality or anything else. On the contrary, quote, we midwife reality into being. Our consciousness, which is never separate from the consciousness of what we're looking at, brings out an aspect of something. And so we are not just passive observers or recipients in the cosmos, we are actors in the cosmos and bringing the cosmos into being, end quote. Much like Pullman, McGilchrist is an admirer of William Wordsworth, and these sentiments at least partly echo that poet's lines about what human beings, quote, have create and what perceive, end quote. wherein every act of observation is equally an act of creativity. This also captures some of the meaning behind the alethiometer, as it literally requires deep, conscious interaction between itself and the consciousness of the person interpreting it. As McGilchrist might say, Lyra's alethiometer, quote, midwifes meaning into existence. At one point in Northern Lights, it is said that reading the alethiometer is a, quote, subtle art, end quote. After all, it is not an oracle that simply tells the future, but rather tells what is likely to happen if certain circumstances continue to unfold, or offers expanded insights into what is already happening in the present. To be sure, it has enormous utilitarian value, whether it being in locating an ice bear's hidden armor, or finding a particular witch's cloud pine, or discovering lost and severed children. But the emphasis in this chapter is the alethiometer as an art form, one specifically linked to the seminal act of seeing and reading life and the universe. In this context, it is quite fitting that the origins of the alethiometer is recounted in Northern Lights, directly tied into the larger cosmos. As we learn from Dr. Lancilius, the witch consul at Alison, the original scholar who invented the first alethiometer had actually been attempting to measure the effects of planetary motion, intending its needles to be drawn to Mars, Venus, and other heavenly bodies. Lancilius reflected on the philosophical disposition of the 17th century in Lyra's alternate prog, noting the instrument was created at a time dominated by signs and symbols, when all art and architecture could be, quote, read like books, end quote. Armed with the right knowledge and intuition, a person could practically, quote, read nature itself, end quote. When the master of Jordan College secretly awards Lyra the alethiometer, she fittingly begins her own journey to learn to read the world all over again. Early in the novel, Pullman describes the alethiometer as having a crystal face suspended in an elegant disc sculpted from fine brass. Masterfully crafted, there are 36 ornate images surrounding the dial, and 3 tiny wheels are used to align 3 delicate hands, or needles, with each picture. A longer fourth hand dances about of its own accord when in use, animated by some inexplicable intelligence. The instrument is later identified as having a Greek name, which is interpreted to mean, quote, truth measure. At times, it is also referred to as a symbol reader. The intricate images encircling the alethiometer span a wide range of beings, animals, and things, such as angels, beehives, dolphins, griffins, moons, serpents, thunderbolts, etc. Pullman has stated that stories often start for him, quote, not with a theme, but with a picture, end quote. Ever since he discovered comic books as a boy living in Australia, he has been struck by the arrangement of panels and pictures on a page. This visual style of storytelling probably influenced the design of the alethiometer, as well as the skillful use of imagery in his own writing. But the theme here turns on reading and literature, and that is where the most interesting parallels can be seen. After Lyra escapes from London and finds refuge with Egyptians, she eventually feels confident enough to reveal her alethiometer to their leaders, John Faw and Farder Coram. The latter is their wise man, their seer, and he immediately recognizes the significance of her device. He begins to mentor her in the art of reading it, kindly advising her to hold a question in mind, quote, without fretting at it or pushing for an answer, end quote, and simply letting the sentient fourth needle settle itself on an image of its choosing. His instruction is sound and ripe with poetic meaning, and is valuable not only to the art of reading, but of writing as well. The most obvious literary correlation here is directly from The Subtle Knife, as the scientist Mary Malone quotes John Keats's famous passage on what he calls, quote, negative capability. Whether communicating with shadow particles in a lab, or reading the alethiometer, or writing masterful odes, the practitioner's mind must be, quote, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, end quote. The importance of negative capability becomes obvious, just as Shelley explained in A Defense of Poetry, acknowledging that not even the greatest poet in the world can will or force himself to write poetry. Farder Coram encourages Lyra with similar advice, knowing there is no fretting or pushing when it comes to inspiration. A person can only allow themselves to be open and receptive, and thus allow creativity to be creative. William Blake put it rather more dramatically calling on the human imagination to, quote, annihilate the selfhood in me, end quote. But it all amounts to the same thing, namely getting out of one's own way. And if a person can achieve this, whether while reading or writing, entirely new vistas of imaginative possibilities may reveal themselves. Keats evoked another similar image, or another similar idea in one of his most famous odes, writing how contemplating a Grecian urn, quote, does tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, end quote. When Lyra first comes to read the Alethiometer, she too sinks into a trance-like, almost meditative state, free from intellect and self-conscious thinking. Experimenting with the Alethiometer somewhat unnerves her at first, as its latent powers seem to indicate it was alive and understood things, quote, like an intelligent being, end quote. But soon it evolves into an intense delight for her, sometimes as a, quote, deep, calm enjoyment, end quote, or other times as a deep thrill, quote. By the end of the first novel, she is intuitively operating all the wheels and needles as naturally as her own limbs and muscles. Unlike the usually laborious methods of translation available to adults, Lyra quickly and instinctively follows the spinning forth needle as if she can see lines and patterns, utterly invisible to everyone else. At one point, Farder Coram likens this process to an internal chess game only she can see, but a better analogy could again be drawn with reading. The Alethiometer effectively brings the reader into a creative conversation, inspiring many of the same inner qualities appreciating poetry requires. Its language is not the one- or two-dimensional prose as discussed in the introduction, but rather three-dimensional poetry, its readings steeped in symbol and metaphor. While interpreting the Alethiometer must be a near inexpressible sensation, Pullman and Lyra make incredibly rich and evocative attempts to capture it. When Farder Coram watches Lyra line up the hands to point at a set of images to answer a question, she instinctively chooses the Madonna figure for mother, an ant for busyness, and an hourglass for time. The old Egyptian asks how she naturally connects the meanings, and she tells him she, quote, feels them as much as sees them, describing it as climbing down a ladder at night. The process is also compared to letting one's eyes focus or allowing one's mind to grow clear and calm like water. Whatever the analogy, the reader always begins with a set of images, their awareness settles, and some of the inspired insight leads them further and further down a seemingly endless chain of meaning and connection. This can never be a fixed, static exercise, any more than reading a poem can. Perhaps one could even say that the Alethiometer reads its owner, as surely as it itself is being read. Others have naturally made such comparisons. I must again single out Alison Croggon and her essay, Pullman's Dark Materials, as she herself is a poet. In contrast to the prose writer's struggle to limit the meanings of language, poets revel in such depth and complexity. Quote, poetry is often clear, but it is never unambiguous, end quote. Croggon explains, adding, quote, it shimmers with many meanings, which shift and coalesce like the images and meanings of Lyra's Alethiometer, end quote. While obviously a prose writer, Pullman clearly revels in such wide-ranging potential and possibility as well. He just indirectly works through the metaphor of the Alethiometer, having his characters extrapolate that a simple image such as an anchor might very well extend indefinitely as a symbol, whether representing hope, a snag, the sea, steadfastness, and so on. This constitutes a quite unique way of seeing life, with a poetic vision and understanding offering a reality newly imbued with near infinite shades of texture and depth. Much like Blake's Worlds in Grains of Sand and Heavens in Wildflowers. To Romanticism and McGilchrist again, he lauds such an approach to reality in his upcoming book, The Matter with Things. McGilchrist believes the usual model of seeing the world as a collection of flat, static, one-dimensional, quote, things is grossly simplistic. On the contrary, he posits a universe unfolding in a series of near limitless patterns and associations. This perfectly lines up with the Alethiometer, specifically as reading it is repeatedly likened to a metaphorical ladder or set of stairs its reader goes down and down with more and more meanings and connections, revealing themselves on every step. The aforementioned physical design of the Alethiometer reinforces such comparisons, as its shape is a round disc. Not only does the circle traditionally symbolize wholeness and totality, it also challenges the narrow, linear, and literal interpretations of the world McGilchrist questions. Thus, to read the alethiometer is to enter a spiral of connection, a web of meaning not bound by narrow, straight lines, much less strict linear thought. This all works to derail a particular manner of seeing William Blake spent most of his artistic life denouncing. Quote, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep," end quote. He prayed. As for him, single vision represented the toxic excesses of the scientific and industrial revolutions. It was a strained literal-mindedness that only produced relentless reductionism, wherein horizons were constantly contracted and collapsed, and the entire universe was ground down into meaningless and random collections of atoms. Pullman's wonderful descriptions of Lyra reading the alethiometer offers a strong antidote to this. When she aligns herself with its mysterious energies, she is immediately swept up in vivid sensations of, quote, grace and power, end quote, as if she were, quote, a young bird learning to fly, end quote, in direct creative participation with reality. She would frame a question in her mind, center her whole being on the device, and when its needle stopped turning and produced an answer or connection, it felt to her as if, quote, great mountain ranges touched by sunlight emerged into vision, end quote. Pullman strikes this note several times in the novel, as Lyra's sudden insights into meanings buried in the alethiometer are compared to a shaft of sunlight breaking through the clouds and revealing something new. Perhaps Tintern Abbey was an unconscious parallel here, as in the second stanza, William Wordsworth highlights his own, quote, serene and blessed mood, end quote, that sometimes inspired him to remember and write, when the world around him would go still and tranquil. Quote, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the light of things, end quote. Sadly, there is no indication that an alternate William Wordsworth exists in Lyra's Britain, but should she ever read these lines, she would, quote, see into the light of them, end quote, almost immediately. Such strong comparisons can be made here, it is hard to believe Pullman didn't consciously, or at least unconsciously, imbue his text with them. His experiences with words and poetry marked him deeply, and it only makes sense to find such allusions buried in his works, intentional or not. The sensation of grace and power that flooded over Lyra when reading the alethiometer no doubt resembled his own feelings when he read Paradise Lost aloud for the first time, or on the day he acquired his first paperback edition of William Blake, which still holds a place of honor in his study. Of course, there are many ways to read his own work, just as there are multiple ways to read poetry, or the alethiometer. In Philip Pullman Master Storyteller, Claire Squires draws on the work of earlier essayists who made this very connection. Squires notes how one critic in particular argued that, quote, through Lyra and the alethiometer, Pullman himself builds a model for the various ways in which the trilogy can be read, end quote. To be explicit, his dark materials can be experienced in a story the way Lyra experiences the alethiometer, direct, immediate, unfiltered, and first-hand. This method no doubt holds enormous purity and power, and it's probably how most of us read it the first time. That was precisely what made it so incredibly impactful. On the other hand, the novels can also be interpreted in a considerably slower, more scholarly and intellectual manner, which is the way the adult scholars of Lyra's world have to interpret the alethiometer. This way incorporates the outside help of books and libraries and lots of methodical cross-referencing. As rewarding as an intertextual analysis of his dark materials may be, complete with references to Milton and Blake in the Bible, nothing can really compare to reading about Lyra and Pantalaimon walking into another world via a bridge to the stars firsthand, as they do at the climax of Northern Lights. Pullman makes it clear he feels this way about poetry. As we deeply explored in the introduction, for him poetry always works first, quote, on the ear and in the mouth, before it lets itself be disentangled by the mind, end quote. A poem's philosophical content may very well be fascinating and rewarding, but nothing can truly and wholly captivate the reader like its potential, quote, incantatory power when heard for the first time. That is the point at which a teenage Pullman surely felt like Lyra, as if he were a young bird, just learning to fly. In the end, we eventually learn what powers the alethiometer. Earlier in the novel, Lyra speculates that spirits of some kind animate it, while Pan rightly intuits its link to elementary particles. In the final chapters of Northern Lights, Lord Asriel confirms the energies inspiring it are indeed dust, as that very particle field is the universe coming to life and knowing itself. We are led full circle back at the beginning of this chapter. While none of the Romantic poets ever mastered an alethiometer, several of them nonetheless felt compelled to use a real-world instrument to symbolize their experience of writing. And if I may be indulged one last literary reference, the favorite wind-haunted toy of Romanticism makes a very compelling comparison with the alethiometer. One lazy English afternoon, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was sitting with his wife and slowly becoming aware of an Aeolian harp hanging outside their house. As the gentle air played on the simple stringed instrument, the breeze carried a spontaneous melody from it, with, quote, long sequacious notes, end quote, that evolved into a, quote, soft floating butchery of sound, end quote. The tranquil notes lulled the poet into a state of drowsy philosophical reflection, and Coleridge began idly musing about the nature of motion and sound, and even a possible, quote, one life within us and abroad, quote, that vibrates and resonates throughout the entire universe. Quote, and what if all of animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, that tremble into thought, as o'er them sweeps, plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each, and God of all, end quote. In other words, just as the wind animates the harp, perhaps the divine wind animates all things in nature, as all living things may share a kind of cosmic soul, or unity. Or to put it back into the nomenclature of his dark materials, perhaps the energy that animate the aurora borealis are also the energies that animate the alethiometer, just as Lyra's blossoming intuition realized. This is also Romanticism's attempt to visualize and understand the perplexing quality of inspiration, with the wind playing the lute also parallel to inspiration playing the poet. Shelley later loved and adopted this same metaphor in both of his works referenced in this chapter. He invoked the west wind to, quote, make me thy lyre, even as the forest is, end quote. And in A Defense of Poetry, directly references man as an, quote, Aeolian lyre, end quote, driven over by, quote, an ever-changing wind, end quote. Much has been made regarding the etymology of the name Lyra, but in this context, the very word lyre, L-Y-R-E, so favored by Pullman's poets, most completely echoes his seminal themes. The universe of his dark materials, like that of Romanticism, is built on reciprocity and animated by participation. And just as the wind plays the lyre and inspiration plays the poet, so dust plays the alethiometer, and Lyra learns what it means to simultaneously read life as well as reimagine it. Yeah, I think they probably enjoyed that. I mean, I gotta say, I did kind of impress myself when I drew the analogy between the Aeolian harp and the alethiometer. Not to mention the little etymology game I played with Lyra and then like lyre, L-Y-R-E. I thought that was pretty good. I don't know. And Anthora is I don't know. She's worried a lot of people may have tuned out during all that. But if you did not, that is utterly fantastic, and I really appreciate it. I hope you found it entertaining and illuminating, or at least insightful in some way. So hopefully I'll be doing more of this type thing, or maybe this will just inspire me to get to Bodley's library over there and work on my book some more, because I do need to do that. At any rate, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and as always,